Thank you, Harry. Okay, so I'll share my screen. Can you see it? Right. So can you see my screen? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay. So hello everyone. My name is Ray Yosifov. I'm an architect and a graduate student on the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at Technion, the Israeli Institute of Technology. I'm excited to be here in this interesting conference and happy to present my research, which I've been conducting under the supervision of Professor Daphna Fischer-Wirtzman, who is also here, simulating pedestrian visual perception, dynamic 3D quantitative analysis. So this research focuses on development of analytical models capable of measuring physical attributes and qualities of the urban environment, which are responsible for the walkable qualities and friendliness towards pedestrians. In the presentation, I will discuss different urban qualities and attributes which are related to the level of walkability of the urban scale, followed by a short review of analytical models which measure the above-mentioned attributes. Then I will present two analytical models which were developed in our lab, the DVA and DESA. Both measure attributes related to walkable environments. The models will be demonstrated for a comparative analysis of 3 case studies. Walkability offers multiple advantages to residents. Research has shown that people who live in a walkable neighborhood tend to be happier and healthier. The neighborhood itself tends to be safer and more sustainable, and property values there are higher. Yet, what makes an environment walkable? What is the definition of a walkable environment, and how can we evaluate it? Here's where things get a little bit trickier. Previous research has shown there is no clear-cut definition for walkability. Forsyth in her study illustrates the various themes and attributes related to walkability. They can be divided into 3 main groups. The first one is environmental conditions, which are associated with the physical dimension, such as the condition of the sidewalk. Another one is social outcomes, which focus on the availability of amenities or the access to public transport. And the last one is proxy for better design, where walkability serves as an indicator of better urban areas that attract redevelopment and have high livability. Generally speaking, a walkable environment is dependent on objectively measured parameters and attributes, such as density, thresholds, diversity of users, of people or design, and access to opportunities via design, access to amenities, or access to public transportation. The many parameters can be evaluated and measured using different evaluation models. The current research focuses on physical urban qualities which are affecting the level of walkability in the city. Research has defined 5 main physical urban qualities related to walkability: human scale, enclosure, transparency, complexity, and imageability. Connectivity and thermal comfort are 2 other qualities that affect the quality of walkability. The various physical attributes are manifested in significant urban components of the urban fabric, from the street layout to the parcellation to the built ecology, the users, and of course the streetscape itself. Each quality encompasses various physical attributes which are quantifiable and measurable. In the diagram below, you can see a part of a literature survey of different assessment models which measure specific attributes related to walkability. The models can be divided into 2 main scales, macroscale and microscale. Macroscale indexes focus on large datasets such as road networks, land use statistics, and GIS analysis. The advantages of macroscale tools are the extent of the analysis, the speed, and the high volume capability. Yet, the large-scale analysis tend to focus on a single or few urban attributes across an entire city, which, due to the inherent constraint of the scale, the methods are bound to reduce the complex urban scape into single specific measurable variables. 2 examples of macroscale indexes are the space index models, which evaluate the street networks and its hierarchy, or walk score, which analyzes the walkability of an environment based on intersection density and the availability of various amenities, without taking into account the qualities of the built environment or the streetscape itself. The microscale is a different story. It is an audit-based scale. The audits allow a detailed examination of the streetscape to its most minuscule feature, including data which may not be available, such as the frequency of public art and street furniture, or the maintenance level of the street. However, the high resolution it requires is costly in time and effort, and therefore the microscale audits are limited to small areas. An example of the microscale index is the Irvine, Minnesota index. It is a survey which contains over 160 items, including the height of the sidewalk and the color of the crosswalk. Each scale is designed for a different type of evaluation method and different goals. In the lab, we aim at focusing on an integrative scale, combining the benefits of both scales together. This scale aims at measuring objectively the urban environment from the pedestrian's point of view using simulation models. This leads us to our initial research objective, the development of analytical models of modifiable urban physical attributes, which can assess the performance of urban fabrics in the fields of walkability, human scale, and the pedestrian experience by simulating pedestrian perception. Out of all the physical qualities shown earlier, the research will focus on three: human scale, enclosure, and transparency. Human scale refers to the size, texture, and articulation of physical elements that proportionally fit human size and walking speed. The physical elements include building sizes, materials, details, pavement textures, vegetation, or street furniture. Enclosure refers to the degree to which streets and other public spaces are visually defined by buildings, walls, trees, and other vertical elements. The enclosure rate is usually measured by a ratio between the building's height to the street width. Here we can see some examples of different streets. The first one is in Oxford Street, London, where a 1-to-1 ratio exists, meaning that the width of the road is equal to the height of the building. The wide road in Salt Lake City, Utah, where the ratio is 1-to-4, and the narrow alleyway in Genova, Italy, where the height-to-width ratio is 8-to-1, meaning that the height of the building is equal to 8 times the width of the alley. Different ratios create different senses of space among pedestrians. The sense of enclosure is affected both by the height-to-width ratio and the dimension of the street itself. Previous research has shown that the comfortable enclosure ratio is between half to 1.5, and the lower limit of sense of enclosure is 1-to-6. Transparency refers to the degree to which people can perceive what lies beyond the edge of the street. Physical elements that influence transparency include walls, windows, doors, fences, landscaping, and opening into mid-block spaces. To examine the urban physical qualities of human scale, enclosure, and transparency, two different simulation models were used, the DVA and the novel model, the DESA. The DVA, or Dynamic Visibility Analysis, explores the relationship between the urban space morphology and the perceived visible space from the pedestrian's perspective. It uses a twin model which divides the city into basic morphological categories by colors. You can see here commercial in purple, residential in orange, offices in yellow, and so on. The DVA measures the visibility of each category along a route from a pedestrian's point of view, as we can see in the video. The chart represents the visibility of each category in every viewpoint along the route from the pedestrian's perspective. Later on, I will elaborate on the DVA results. Here you can see a DVA simulation in Lyon, France, along an actual walk across the same route. The DVA captures and simulates the core morphological aspects of the city, which are available as large data sets, focusing on the built volume, the topography, the land uses, the trees, roads, water bodies, and so on, while not taking into account many microscale features such as windows, other people, awnings, and more. If the microscale data was available as measured data set, it could have been integrated into the DVA as well. For the purpose of this research, the DVA was upgraded. First, it considers the vertical threshold suggested by Jan Gelb, which divide buildings into 3 parts based on the amount of potential interaction with the streetscape. The first 2 floors, which have the highest amount of potential, floors 3 and 4, and 5th floor and beyond, which is the limit of street level interaction. In addition, the DVA can split the perceived data based on horizontal distance-based thresholds, which can help identify objects in the near visual field in contrast to more distant objects. The second model is the DESA, or Dynamic Enclosure Street Section Analysis. It is a novel analytical model that measures the built environment, physical dimensions of the street in a sequential order. It measures the building height of each edge, the distance between the built edge to the sidewalk width, the road width, the set distance, and the right of way. The measurements are later used to calculate the enclosure rate of a street. In the diagram, you can see the enclosure ratio along a street. Each chart measures a different street edge. The different charts may offer a more detailed assessment along a broad scale, as the enclosure ratio is usually portrayed in the literature as symmetrical, but in reality, the buildings along the street may have different heights, and therefore different enclosure rates. The integration of both DESA and DVA offers a simplified version of the built streetscape and explores its relationship between the physical dimensions to the visible streetscape. The models will be demonstrated for comparative analysis of 3 urban fabrics in New York City. Each urban fabric is different from the others and is tested along a 500-meter route. Case study A is located on 10th Avenue. It is a mixed-use avenue with commercial facades with primarily residential buildings, most of which are 5 stories tall, with some high-rise towers. Case study B is on 5th Avenue in Manhattan as well. It is a main avenue with a high volume of commercial activity. The built environment consists mainly of high-rise buildings. And case study C is in Astoria, Queens, where 9 to 15 stories apartment buildings characterize the streetscape, which lacks an active ground floor. The buildings are distant from the streets, in which there are many trees. The built environment of every case study was modeled and differentiated by land use and vertical distance thresholds. Street trees were added as well. The different built edges of the streets are shown here in scale. Each case study was measured using the DVA and DESA along a 500-meter route. The different rays represent different visible categories as seen by the pedestrian. So these are the DVA results of the analysis of 5th Avenue case study B. Each visible category is represented in different color. You can see here commercial in purple, the roads and sidewalks in shades of gray, trees and parks in green, and sky in light blue. The most dominant visual land use is commercial activities on the ground floor, which may offer potential for interaction. And there are some blank facades along the route, visualized by the hashed color. The different results of each case study are presented here. The results take into account all of the rays, all of the lengths. In case study A and B, 10th Avenue and 5th Avenue, most of the visible space viewed by the pedestrian is commercial activities, which indicate a high potential for interaction on the street. Case study C is dominantly green, with a high volume of blank facades, which indicate a much lower amount of potential interaction. The marked areas indicate the potential level of interaction along the routes and where a redesign may be considered. Focusing on visible objects at the 30 meter threshold, the upper limit of interaction-based distance indicates that the activities with the potential for interaction creation are still visible in case studies A and B. And in contrast, in case study C, you can hardly see any buildings other than the blank facades, because most of the buildings are at some distance from the sidewalk and behind the trees. Looking at the DESA results, we can see that the enclosure rate is between 0.5 to 1.5, which is considered a comfortable ratio in the marked green areas. This occurs mainly for our case study A, 10th Avenue, at the beginning of case study B, 5th Avenue, whereas in case study C, most of the enclosure rate is below half. In this slide, we can see the integration of both DVA and DESA, where marked green areas represent the correlation between positive DVA values and the comfortable enclosure rate as seen in the DESA. We can see them in green for positive values and red for negative values. They represent 2 different segments of the street with different enclosure and DVA results. Here we can see in red a high enclosure rate along with a major blank facade in the street. And in contrast, a more comfortable enclosure rate and active commercial facade with street trees where the green picture is of the street. So to sum up, the research focuses on 3 urban physical qualities related to walkability and measuring them using 2 analytical models, the DVA and DESA. The combination of them can assist in examining different environments where the perceived visible space in the streetscape generate a better suited space to pedestrians' well-being. By creating a twin model, we can examine critical urban physical and morphological qualities. The simulations allow a quantitative analysis in an integrative scale. of the amount of potential interaction on the street regarding its physical dimension. The models are based on knowledge gathered by previous research. Further development will focus on assessment of the two models with surveys or experiments in an immersive virtual environment, where the results of the DESA and the DVA can be compared to surveys and audits. As shown here, it can be used to analyze different design alternatives in the early stages of planning, while making a more conscientious design decision based on comparative analysis from the pedestrian's point of view, measuring in a quantitative simulation the pedestrian visual perception. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Any questions, just hold off for now. You can post them in your chat if you want and come back to them later. But yeah, thanks again. Next speaker is a colleague of mine from Manchester, Ron Barad. He's co-authored this presentation with Geoffrey Caruso, Nuno Pinto, and Marco Vigo, who'll be talking today on perceived variables in virtual reality, methodological analysis. So please take it away, Ron.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share screen. Like the good little boy that I, there we go. And hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see okay. My name is Ron. If you don't know me, I hope you will soon. And if you thought that Roy's presentation was beautifully done and had some amazing illustrations in it, prepare to be very disappointed in mine. This was more of a theater of the mind experience. So allow me to take you on a journey. First of all, an introduction, because that's where you start. If you don't know what an introduction is, this might be a bit advanced for you. Who is Ron? I am a University of Manchester postgraduate student. I'm terrified of my own funeral. I don't know what you want to hear about me. I'm a human being with feelings. And today I'm going to be talking about a report that I'm writing, effectively a work in progress, that aims to answer these questions. How can immersive virtual environments be utilized in user-centered urban environment research? And what are the comparative benefits of using today's virtual environment technology for urban environment research in contrast to existing methods? Now, in answering those questions, a case study we can use is perceived density, because we want to look at perceived environmental variables. And we can assess how accurate a layperson's perceptions of urban population density are, and what factors most influence a layperson's perception of urban population density. What that means in English is we want to find out how we can use virtual reality to make research in a specific field better, and then figure out if actually it did make it better at all compared to the conventional methods. To figure that out, we can use VR on the case study of perceived density. For example, can a person tell how dense a place is just by looking at it, or what factors most affect the differences in people's answers? And in doing that, we'll also be evaluating, whether VR is actually more useful than conventional methods, while also answering an open question, which is nice. Double whammy. The presentation you're looking at starts with an introduction. We're at the end of that now. We're going to define density. There's going to be a fun little twist. I'm going to explain to you why this matters, why you should care, and then what it is that I'm actually doing. This is a long justification before I actually get to the project. And then we'll conclude by ending the presentation. So our first topic, density. What is density? Great question. I don't have an answer. No one really does. It's a complicated, multidimensional concept that can be expressed differently for different people. Churchman in 1999 expressed his idea that density can differ between academic disciplines, between countries, cultures, languages, even dialects. Each person might have a different idea of what I mean when I say, how dense is this room? For example, the classroom I'm in right now has no people in it, but a lot of chairs. It's dense in terms of chairs. We'll be focusing on urban population density today, which I will from now on be referring to quite obnoxiously as urpopton or poverty, whichever you guys prefer, which you can measure in the number of people per unit area or the amount of urban buildup in an area. And if you heard that and instantly got angry and said, actually, congrats, you're in the right place. When you first start looking at urban population density, you'll find some really interesting things. You might find higher urban density has negative effects on inhabitants' mental well-being, high definitely. You may find that more natural environments have positive effects on a person's mental health or psychological recovery from stress. BMI isn't the perfect measure of health, but it is strongly correlated with urban buildup. You might find that urban form and sprawl both have strong correlations to overweight in inhabitants. All these are incredibly interesting and incredibly supported by evidence and literature. But if you start reading a bit more, you'll see that everything's subjective. And a person's idea of how dense the area they're living in might influence them a lot more than the actual density itself. That same study I referenced a second ago from Fischer-Gewürzmann and the student Heffler makes that distinction clear in itself. A lot of other studies do focus on perceived density as opposed to density as an objective measure. And a large amount of urban planning research confirms a connection between greenness or walkability and well-being. Roy just talked about how important walkability is. Such a large section that I didn't have room for any good amount of citations on this slide. There's going to be a slide at the end of the presentation with just greenness and well-being citations. Why is that important? Because if greenness has a connection to well-being and greenness and density can coexist, then perhaps perceived density matters more than objective density. I think everyone in this room already knows everything I've said so far. We're all here. This is a special session for perceived urban space. But another point, Barton et al. Found that higher density can improve inhabitants' quality of life if handled with sensitive and balanced growth policies. Just to really hammer home, we're looking at the perception of density. So what the heck is perceived density, guys? I'm very confused by that. Well, worry no more. I'm here. A man named Amos Rappaport in 1975 wrote a very influential and important report called Redefining Density, or Towards a Redefinition of Density, something along those lines. Effectively stating, individuals can read an environment as dense or not dense, largely independently or completely irrespective of the actual number of people per unit area. And perceived density might have very little to do with objective density. This has later been supported by further studies. But the important part I want to focus on is Rappaport also outlines some 50-something possible factors that might affect a person's perception of the density of their area. These go from greenery to the noise, to the lighting, to the tempos, to their personal experience in high or low densities, to their social interaction with people around them. Something I found really interesting is that he considered the idea of social homogeneity or heterogeneity as an element of density. For example, if I'm walking down the street, see a crowd of people, they all look the same as me, for example. I might not really register them, whereas the second there's someone who looks significantly different to everyone around them walks by, that's a social engagement for me because I'm suddenly paying attention. And the more attention you're paying, the more socially engaged you are, the more dense you might feel, because you'll run into more people when really it's the same number, but they're just more different. I just thought that was a nice little interesting bit from that report. Those factors affecting density have been quantitatively tested somewhat in the past. Fischer-Gewürzmann, who comes up inevitably in every presentation I give about my project, has done that herself multiple times. But the more studies you find in this particular area that try to quantitatively approach the problem of subjective perceived variables in an environment, the more you find that either the population, the sample population is very homogeneous, or the sample itself is very small, or the methods used were not necessarily applicable to every situation, or that the definition of density used in a study was very limited. You'll find a lot of these studies, it's not that they're flawed, it's just that they're not massively generalizable. That doesn't make them worthless, it makes them very valuable. But it's a gap in research that should be filled, is what I'm trying to say. Effectively, to codify a full formal definition of factors that affect perceived density by quantitative means, as far as I'm aware, has not quite been solved. And why does that matter? Well, hi again, Daphne. Perceived density is inversely proportional to inhabitants' well-being. Plenty of other studies that Fisher-Diversman has done have pointed to that. By understanding clearly the factors that can be manipulated to best decrease density, we can make cities a better place to live, and populations will continue to grow, so handling density is important. The flip side of that, which I quite like, is that most of the recommendations for policy or for urban planning to decrease perceived density also coincide with separate recommendations that generally improve well-being. More greenery has been shown time and time again to be an improvement for physical and mental health, while also potentially lowering perceived density quite drastically, which in itself might improve physical and mental health. So there's really no reason not to pursue this line of thinking. On both sides, it seems to offer something. So what are we doing about it? Well, that's a very good question. Effectively, what I'm planning to write, or what I'm already writing, is a report just to express the state of the art and the conventional wisdom and the steps needed to be taken in order for research like this to continue, because that gap in research is not filled for what I see as very clear reasons. You'll find, if you try to pursue this research, that software solutions for modeling cities and modeling perceived variables in urban environments are either expensive or hard to use or inaccessible, or need to be designed from scratch. And you'll find that the research methods you'll need to use in order to evaluate people's responses to an environment are also not defined that clearly by existing literature. There's a lot of variety and a wide range of possible choices. The report itself is going to be composed of 3 sections. The first of which is a literature review, which is largely, say, 75% done. I'd say a lot of the references that I've used in this presentation is just a little taste of what's going to be in there. It's a fun read to find out more about this stuff, but I recommend no one read any of the other literature. Just read my report. Just read it. The lit review itself will be divided into 2 sections: perceived density and well-being, and virtual reality and research methods. But those can be largely extracted into perceived variables in an urban environment and methods to assess them. This is just one case study of how this sort of approach to research can be applied. What we want to know from that is, effectively, from our lit review, we want to find out how people have tried studying perceived variables in the past, how people have used virtual reality and other unconventional, innovative research methods that use the power of modern computing in research, and how we can combine those 2 to best design future research in the field. The next section of the report will be a methods analysis, where we plan to discuss a range of potential approaches to virtual urban research design. Like I mentioned before, we want to assess software for city modeling on 3 dimensions: on immersion, that's how real a place feels to a person within it, effectively how useful it is when you get results from it; control, effectively how well a researcher can manipulate a model, otherwise why not just go outside; and availability, how accessible, affordable, and feasible it is to use one of these software solutions. We also want to assess research methods for gathering data, like I mentioned before, Likert scales, unstructured interviews, eye tracking. What data is worthwhile and collectible, easily, affordably useful for this kind of research. The final step of this report, final element of it, is a decision-making framework for the pursuit of the same kind of research in future, just to direct researchers towards the methods and approaches that best fit their needs for a specific study. For example, just a straight one, if you're looking to study beauty in immersive virtual environments, you want to stick people in an IVE and you want them to assess how beautiful a place is. It's a very subjective, perceived variable. but you don't have much time and you don't have much funding. How can you best approach that study? What software is available for you? What methods would be best suited for your limitations and for your needs? I'm not going to answer that question in this presentation. I don't know the answer. But that's something that we're hoping to present with justification from literature rather than just from my personal opinion. In the big scheme of things, this report hopefully will be fully drafted by the new year. The next step would then be to use it and take our own advice, design a study. We can evaluate our own framework firsthand with that study because we have used the framework, and we can see whether it's actually worth everything we put into it, how it can be improved for future research, and how that study reflects on the subject matter for this particular field where there is a little bit of a gap, a bit of wiggle. We're going to finish in a conclusion. If you've been to one of these things, you know that that's very common practice. Here's my parting words. I'm going to state effectively as a fact, as something that we are taking for granted, assuming that urban perceptions do affect well-being. There's plenty of evidence for it. We're going to take that as an assumption. And currently, from our experience and from my experience of speaking to other people who have approached this field, studying those perceptions can be complicated or expensive. It can require time, talent, or money, 3 things that researchers might not have all of. And to give a full evaluation of the landscape for urban perception research design, that's just the first step towards improvement, which is what we hope to do, to facilitate future research to fill these little gaps that have been forming in urban planning. Here's just a list of references for you, and here is the list of greenery and well-being references. If you're interested in a full list of these, I can give you, I think there's a literature compilation that I found somewhere that's very useful for this. I want to thank you all for your time, and I hope to see you soon. It would be lovely to see you in Manchester someday.
Thanks, Ron. Certainly very interesting. Moving on to the next talk, third of today's session, we have Ocean Lapid and Efrat Blumenfield-Lieberthal. They're talking today on Tel Aviv's roofs. So please take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm sharing the screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
Okay, great. So I'm starting. Okay, so hi, my name is Osher. The meaning of it in Hebrew is actually joy. I'm an architect and an MA student at David Azrieli School of Architecture at Tel Aviv University. And I'm about to present to you my current research, which is my thesis research on Tel Aviv's roofs, guided by Dr. Efrat Blumenfield-Lieberthal, that is here with us. So how did I end up researching roofs? Since I can remember myself, even before that, as you can see in the picture, it's me on my dad's shoulders, and my dad is 2 meters high. I explored our world from above. Other than that, I always liked looking at maps, Google Maps, etc., exploring cities. And this hobby became very useful in my architectural studies, as you can imagine. And today I work as an architect and urban planner in an architect office in Tel Aviv. So I'm also doing it for a living now. But I really decided to research roofs in the city for my thesis during the first COVID-19 lockdown in Tel Aviv. I don't know if you were aware of that, but during March and April 2020, the first COVID lockdown in Israel was very, very severe. Basically, we almost couldn't leave our apartments or homes, and so many Tel Avivians started to use their building roofs. I lived in Tel Aviv center at the time, and I saw the buildings around me. All the roofs were filled with people doing exercise, playing, doing any kinds of activities you can think of. And that was the moment I thought that this space in my city has so much potential, and I want to research and exploring it. So the roof, or the fifth front, has been part of our built environment since man built his first shelter, and the basic purpose of it always was to protect us from natural forces. But throughout history and a variety of cultures, people have used their roofs for other purposes as well. One example of a culture that knew how to use the roof in our area, the Mediterranean basin, is the village you see in the picture. There is no chance I'm going to say its name right, Çatal Hayuk, in Anatolia, Turkey nowadays. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and as you can see, there is evidence, sketches, and research that shows that the village was built as a collection of cubes, and people were using the roofs, living there, sleeping there, and moving from one roof to another throughout ladders and holes in the so-called ceiling. Another example of these uses of the roofs in our area is the Arab village house. As you can see here in the paintings from Tangier and Jerusalem, the Arab house in this area used to have a flat roof, so people could sleep on it during the warm summer nights, having all sorts of social gatherings and more. Unfortunately, even though we can see that in the past different societies in our area use the roof for many kinds of uses, if you take a look at Tel Aviv rooftops today, this is what you will see. The rooftop in Tel Aviv has been neglected over the years, covered with tear, satellite dishes, antennas, and solar water heaters. And today, these are the typical components of the roofs in Tel Aviv. So what went wrong? How did we get to that? The problem started from the beginning, really from the beginning, from the first houses that were built in Tel Aviv. The city was established in 1909 by Jewish newcomer, we say Olim in Hebrew, who came from Europe. They built the first streets of Tel Aviv. On the left, you can see Rothschild Boulevard, and on the right, Herzl Street. We can see that these first houses have tiled roof. How did they get here? Simply because the newcomers brought with them the roof typology they knew from Europe. Now, besides the fact that these kinds of roof doesn't fit the climate in Israel, they prevent the different uses of the flat roof we saw earlier, which was somehow common in this area. Things or roof started to get better during the 30s when the international style, the Bau style, whatever you want to call it, became popular in the city thanks to modern architects who came here and had worked with Le Corbusier. One of Le Corbusier's 5 principles of architecture is the fifth facade that is meant to be used as a garden. Many of the new neighborhoods in Tel Aviv were built with a flat roof at the time, but they didn't have any gardens on them. But because they were built flat, the potential to use them for different uses is still there. And this is why my main goal is to reveal this potential and to understand what is already going on in this huge urban space. Furthermore, after COVID-19 lockdowns that helped Tel Avivians to get a glimpse of this potential and start to actualize it. I started by looking at what other cities around the world have already done regarding mapping the roof. In recent years, we have witnessed many cities that have rediscovered the roofs and utilized them for a variety of purposes in order to improve life in dense urban environments. As you can see here, I brought a few examples. While the current trends in these terms are using roof for green space and urban agriculture. So here you can see on the right, Melbourne project of mapping all kinds of green and solar energy roofs in the city. And mainly in order to convince citizens to use the roof as part of their way to deal with the urban heat island as a result of the climate crisis. Also, there is New York City green roof mapping, as well as some research I brought from Hong Kong regarding all kinds of roof farming in dense cities. But all of these projects are dealing mostly with green roofs and not with a variety of uses. Anyway, Tel Aviv is still way behind, even on that, as we don't have any similar mapping yet, and that is where I'm entering the picture. Urban roof spaces are, in fact, huge public-private spaces which become more attractive as city densities increase and land in the city becomes more expensive, but they are rarely mapped. The purpose of the study is to uncover the potential that lies within city roofs for various purposes. The mapping allows for a deeper understanding of this unique and unexplored space in the context of the existing situation, its sources, and its effects, and may assist planners in finding ways to realize its potential. The research question is whether there are any recognizable patterns concerning the use of Tel Aviv roofs, and if so, how can they be characterized? In my research, I use digital visualization tools to analyze the roof spaces of shared residential buildings in Tel Aviv. The study focused only on shared residential buildings and ignores public ones, as the use of public roofs for various purposes is already more common in the city and is less complex for regulatory implementation. Additionally, there is no tension between the private and the public on these roofs. The mapping includes two major parameters: the morphological parameters, like the position in the field, the height of the structure, level of exposure to the environment, the proportions, the proximity to neighboring structures, and more, and the functional parameter, in what way the roof is used or not used. Based on the mapping, I identify different types of urban roofs in Tel Aviv and analyze their characteristics concerning socioeconomic, social, constitutional, and constructive issues, as well as their connection and effect. So how am I actually doing it? For a start, I've chosen 4 neighborhoods in the city for pilot research I already accomplished. I am using a grasshopper code in order to randomly sample a number of roofs in each neighborhood. And then after I have the randomly selected roofs, the mapping is carried out using 2 main tools. The first is Tel Aviv Municipality GIS system, from which the basic data of the building is derived, as well as other data related to the morphological parameter of the mapping. The second tool is the detailed 3-dimensional model of Tel Aviv, developed by an Israeli startup named Simplex Mapping Solution. A key advantage of the model is its high resolution of 3 centimeters, which enables me to explore the fine details of the space. As you can see here in the picture in the middle, I can really see what is going on the roofs, activities that take place on rooftop, as well as other morphological parameters by examining the roofs and everything on them. The pilot results are based on a sample of 80 roofs located at residential buildings throughout Tel Aviv. We employed descriptive statistics of the analysis, such as histograms and correlation tests, to determine the frequency of observed use and the strength of the relationships, positive or negative, between the various morphological parameters and observed uses, and then statistical significance. Here you can see the result of all the 4 neighborhoods that were selected, and you can notice the difference and the uses we have defined for this mapping: well maintained and built, temporary furnitured, leisure, gardening, empty, and neglected. The differences are noticeable between each other, and in particular between the northern neighborhoods, the Old North and Lev Ha'ir, typified by high socioeconomic levels, and the southern neighborhoods, Neve Ofer and Florentin, typified by low socioeconomic levels. According to the results, the following parameters were identified as being relevant in the context of how the roofs of the city are being used: height of the building, numbers of floor, and the division of the roof into separate areas or not, and the existence of balconies in the building, the position of the building on the plot, if it's a part of a larger block or an individual building, and additional construction on the roof as well. Furthermore, the studies has also revealed that there is a strong connection between the observed uses that occur on the same roof in the southern neighborhoods, but the disconnection is greatly weakened in the northern neighborhoods. Okay, so after doing this pilot research, I entered the real research for my thesis, in which I decided to sample 300 roofs from 6 neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, And these days, I'm in the process of collecting all of the data from them. I chose 3 northern neighborhoods, the Old North, the New North, and Levair, and 3 southern neighborhoods, Roltin, Neve Ofer, and Shapira. Using my Grasshopper code, I'm collecting 50 randomly selected roofs from each neighborhood. So I have a total of 150 from the north and 150 from the south. So right now I can't wait to see what differences and correlation we will find in the new and wider data. While working on the research for the past year, I realized there is another important aspect I have to take into account while collecting the data and analyzing it. The very fast and intense urban renewal processes that Tel Aviv is undergoing in the past few years, and that is definitely changing the roof space of the city. And these changes are bringing the rooftops to the headlines of the news in Israel. I did some Google Translate for you. And one specific roof to be accurate, we're talking about the roof of the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert. He bought a penthouse in a newly renewal building in Tel Aviv, and he's complaining that all the other residents of the building are using the upper roof, the shared roof, which is right above his penthouse. The residents on their part are saying that according to the law, they have the legal right to use this space for the social gathering. And they're basically right because the roof is part of the building's shared property. At the moment, there is a legal order preventing them to use the roof until further discussion. And I think that this is just a preview of some of the challenges we are going to face as long as Tel Avivians will continue to rediscover the rooftops and use them. And this is another reason for the value of my research, to understand what is going on now and to help the planners and the authorities to create policies together for this space that doesn't exist at all right now. In the light of this case, I realized I need to have a deeper understanding of the legal aspect of the rooftops in the city. And I learned that the most important part of it regards the ownerships of the rooftops, which is written in the common house rule terms of every building. It's an agreement between all the apartments owners in an apartment building. The urban renewal process is changing the default term, which used to say that the roof is part of a shared property, the same as the lobby, stairs, etc. After going through an urban renewal process, a penthouse is usually added to a building, and many times the right of the roofs are being transformed to the penthouse owner alone. So it means that all the other residents are actually losing the right to use their building roof. In order to see those changes and realize their influence, I examined 10 buildings in the New North neighborhood that had already finished their urban renewal process. I collect their data using the same research tool, the CTGIS system, and the 3D model of Simplex. And together with them, I also got the common house rule terms of each of the building, while comparing the old state of the roof before the renewal with the current state of the roof after the renewal. In the picture, you can see the same building, one building before and after the renewal process. I discovered many differences, but I saw that beside the ownership change, most of the new roofs are usually being separated into several levels, so that as many as possible apartments will be sold as rooftop apartments and bring the highest value to the entrepreneur. And of course, this is just a quick glimpse into the result, and I'm still working on it, so to be continued. And to conclude, the rooftops space in Tel Aviv is a space with a very wide variety of connections at different levels that are affected by the complex of life that takes place below and above the rooftops. In the absence of a throughout research into this space, there is a potential for understanding and developing it in order to benefit the residents of the city. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Moshe. Really interesting talk, very clear. Last presentation is Anna Zanchetta and Mark Birkin. They'll be talking on the future of high streets, investigating post-pandemic scenarios in the UK. I can see them in the chat, so yeah, please feel free to share your screen and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Just trying to arrange the technology as usual. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, you're not yet in presenter mode. But
Yeah, I'm just getting there. How's that?
yeah, perfect.
Okay, thanks. Just 15 minutes, yes, Harry?
Yeah, give or take, that's fine. 18 if you want.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks everybody. So today I'd like to present to you some work regarding the future of high streets in a post-pandemic world, representing the Alan Turing Institute. So my own background is I'm a professor of geography at the University of Leeds. I'm also the program director for urban analytics at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Institute for Data Science and AI in the UK, and one of the sponsors of this conference. Very glad to be invited and to be here. Most of the work is attributed to my co-author, Anna Zanchetta, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Turing Institute, and would have been presenting this work were she not now on maternity leave, although I think I did see her face in the audience, which if it's the case is very naughty, because you should be concentrating on family matters, Anna. But if you're here, very nice. I'm impressed by your dedication. I'd like to talk about two models, broadly speaking, in this presentation. And so the first one that I'll spend a little time on is some work that we have been developing in response to the aforementioned COVID pandemic, and therefore going back about 18 months. And the work was initiated by both the Turing Institute and the Royal Society. So one of the things that happened at the outbreak around about March last year was that the Royal Society reached out to the academic community for support in approaches to tackling the coronavirus pandemic. And some of that was motivated by a desire to support the kinds of government advisors and scientific communities that were getting pulled in directly to the response to tackling COVID. So thinking particularly about these groups that certainly the UK audience of this talk will be familiar with seeing regularly on the television and so forth. So SAGE, SPI-M, the scientific advisors to government, and with the Royal Society as the National Scientific Society being keen to provide maximum possible support to the individuals in the front line of that. But also I think with a view to, kind of longer term thinking about how it is that we can prepare ourselves more effectively in the longer term in this sort of context. And so one of the things that we started talking about that I think was particularly interesting was, again, clearly I think in all countries there's been a lot of focus on the epidemiological impacts and models of the spread of the pandemic. And to my mind, you right through this period, really surprisingly little on the spatial, social, behavioural effects, which are clearly crucially important in creating the context for transmission, the spread of the epidemic, and of course providing absolutely crucial background to the sorts of conversations that we've needed to have about the lockdowns of schools and workplaces and bars, restaurants, you know, all these kind of leisure environments. And so the work that we have been involved in for the last 18 months has been about how those, you know, kind of social and behavioural and geographical influences might more adequately be incorporated into the kinds of models that people have developed and applied to these questions of management and policy intervention of you know, clearly this tremendously challenging set of circumstances. Oops, going the wrong way. And so, you know, if the question is, you know, is there a set of spatial and behavioural models that can help us think through this kind of problem, then, you know, I think the answer to that question is clearly yes. And the sorts of models that we're specifically thinking about and interested in here, a combination really, and clearly in 15 minutes I'm not going to go into any detail on these models at all, but particularly about spatial microsimulation, spatial interaction modeling, again, audiences who are like me familiar with European conferences, colloquia on quantitative and theoretical geography going back over the years will be very familiar with these kinds of methods. So, you know, what we're talking about here is mobilizing the kind of individual-based demographic models, the spatial microsimulations, the behavioral models of interactions of people with their workplaces, commuting patterns, retail behavior, you know, these kinds of activities through spatial interaction modeling. Okay, so here are some sample results, and I'll again inevitably talk through these quite briefly. There is actually a paper as of last week, which is referred to at the bottom of the screen there in Social Science and Medicine. If you are interested, that's available online. You can go and have a look at what we've done in a bit more detail. So here we're looking at, yeah, I'm just emphasizing that combination on the left-hand side of the kind of the temporal simulation of pandemic patterns within a city region. The right-hand side here is focusing more on the spatial patterns. If your geography is exceptional, you might recognise that as the county of Devon in the UK. My hat off to you if you can do that. But anyway, that's where it is down in the right-hand side there. And then. So as before, we can start thinking specifically about interventions, scenarios, lockdowns, vaccinations, other kinds of policy interventions, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in this illustration here, we are thinking about this kind of applying this kind of modelling capability to the timing of a lockdown intervention. And of course, one has to be careful how one presents this kind of thing. But you know, clearly, no surprises. Common sense tells us that the timing is very important. And were we able to act more promptly to slow things down, closures, etc., then we can see some you know, significant changes in transmission patterns, hospitalizations, and yeah, mortality and so forth. And so that was well, and this work is ongoing. So I think an interesting piece of work. It's also complemented by specific simulation environments for this kind of policy intervention and control. So again, here we're looking at an interface of the same region, representing Devon with a series of specific buildings and households, the white dots, and we can start to see, for example, on the left-hand side here in an interface, how different cases are evolving through a simulation, we can look at control parameters of various underlying conditions or interventions. And I thought we would have one where we could actually see the white dots turning into red as we actually model through time the transmission of a pandemic. But again, you can see examples in more detail on this kind of thing in the paper. Okay, so that's the a bit of the context in terms of the pandemic modelling. The second thing, and what we're concentrating more on in the abstract, if you are looking at some point at the booklet of abstracts, is then thinking about you know, what happens as we move on into various kind of post-pandemic or new normal sorts of situations. And so one of the things that is of interest to a lot of people in this circumstance is what might be happening in our city centres, and particularly in the retail sector. So very briefly and broadly, background here, you know, going back 30 years, I guess, into the last century, then we had a very buoyant set of high streets in terms of retail activity that had grown up over a period of time. Going into the 2000s, then we started to see some variations in performance of those centres relating to things like financial downturn, the onset of austerity, and then particularly regarding transitions to online shopping and e-commerce. And so on top of that, again, as we'll all be aware from stories in the press and so forth, COVID wasn't the greatest thing to be happening to a retail sector with many difficulties and challenges. On the other hand, one might think that there is a combination of opportunities, or certainly a set of policy circumstances that need to be responded to here. I mean, this I think is a fairly typical sort of story which illustrates some of the issues and perhaps opportunities here. So yeah, I said this is just one other number, but COVID provides an unlikely boost for Chester's ranking amongst best shopping spots. If we were actually physically in Manchester, this would be a nice topical one, since Chester's pretty close by. But the story here is that, for places like Chester, as compared to the bigger metropolitan centres like Manchester and Liverpool, mentioned in the third bullet on the right-hand side there, there has been some positive news here. And essentially the narrative is, as we've been locked down, increasingly working at home rather than travelling to work. And so the centres that are focused on those kind of residential and local environments are tending to fare better than the big city centres with the high working populations. And so, for example, the policymakers in the City and Local Growth Unit, Department for Housing, Communities, the local government, and now Levelling Up in the UK are very interested in how do we manage our way into the next stages of the post-pandemic world and back to some kind of a stable situation, possibly somewhere between these, the kind of extremes of the pre-pandemic world with your major work-focused city centre driven high streets, or these much more localized pandemic type situations. And so, in terms of a broad framework, the way that a lot of these organizations are thinking about this problem is in terms of different kinds of component populations. I've talked particularly about the workforce, about the residential population, but also extremely important, and again, especially in some of these larger metropolitan areas, student populations, visitor populations, both your kind of local and international, in terms of tourists, that kind of thing. And so here, very, very conceptually, is a similar thing to what I've been saying about Chester, where we may think in a in a metropolitan situation, we have these very heavy workforce concentrations driving the prosperity of our high streets and city centres, and in the pandemic type situation, we've really seen that a combination of factors, as I said, those workers being at home rather than at work, but also at the same time the loss of student populations, certainly international visitors being badly affected, even though there may be more opportunities in terms of domestic tourism and those kinds of things, and almost kind of the reverse in the satellites, the Chesters, the local centres. And so the objective of this part of the work is to try to build on those actual pandemic simulations towards something that can support this kind of thinking around retail regeneration. And so the link between the two things is if we think about those residential activities, those commuter flows, these are common to both the kind of the retail evaluation and the actual study of the transmission, the pandemic itself. You see in terms of the framework that I've put forward, we need to augment that with some understanding of what's going on with student populations, and we're actually quite well on with that. And then the visitor piece is actually quite complicated, not least in terms of the sorts of data sets that you need to think about to tease out those kind of patterns. And so that actually remains a piece of work that's ongoing at the moment in the group. So I'm getting very close, I think, to my time limits, but fortunately I'm on the last slide. So in terms of some reflections and conclusions at this point, clearly pandemic has had huge impacts in terms of its both direct impact, but also the way that it's going to affect economic organization and society and so forth. And we've been trying to demonstrate in combination with kind of important national scientific organizations that geographers and regional scientists have an important perspective to bring to bear on this problem in relation to the immediate and long-term impacts. I haven't said a lot about the kind of the AI and data dimension, but I think as we start to think about these future scenarios and configurations of land use and alternative options, then there is actually a lot of scope for further development of optimization and complex data science approaches and that kind of thing. And also really a talk for another day. But if we're thinking about either the pandemic itself, if we're thinking about long-term pandemic response, a lot of the issues and approaches and modeling structures are going to be similar if we're thinking about other kinds of problems, like of course net zero is in everybody's mind at the moment, but we might equally be asking a question about how we're organising our cities in a sustainable way in the future. And actually the kind of models that we've purposed to the pandemic in this work are the sorts of things that we've been thinking about long term in relation to supporting long-term infrastructure investment scenarios in housing, transport, all those kinds of questions. So I think I'm at time, even on my 18-minute limit. I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mark.
I'll stop there.
Okay, so that concludes the talks for this session. We have plenty of time now for a discussion, if you're willing to engage and do so. So please feel free to stick your hand up and ask any questions, and we'll go from there. I think, Efrat, you've got your hand up. Do you want to take it away first?
No, I just clapped for my...
Oh, that was a clap. I thought it was a hand up. Do we have any questions for our authors? Anybody? Yes, Geoffrey.
Mute myself, sorry. It's actually a question from the last slide from Mark. I know you've not elaborated on AI, but obviously it's an interesting topic, especially for this session. And I just wonder how you relate those trends you just show us to the smart city debate. And I know you've been working a lot on smart cities, and I mean, being a wrong concept, basically, right? Well, or not that useful, maybe at that time. So, do you think it kind of become a more useful concept today because of the COVID, or I don't know. I would like to have your feeling about that smart city stuff, which is supposedly going with more AI, more maybe augmented stuff, more data. Has the situation changed, at least from an English perspective or from the UK perspective, in that respect? What you're feeling about that? Sorry, it's not a very precise question, but
yeah, no, thank you. It's a very interesting set of issues there, and if you'd spoken to me 2 years ago, and probably still now, actually, I mean, I may have got you wrong. You may not be entirely with me, but I'm a bit of a smart city skeptic. I think sometimes and generally I tend to be skeptical of bags of technologies that are looking for a purpose kind of thing. I think that COVID has focused our minds in some degree. I mean, one of the things that I find very depressing actually is so one of the other things that interests me is purely the data. I think a lot of this is about data and what data can we use to understand and to plan interventions within cities. And again, if you asked me 18 months ago, I'd have said this is our real chance to persuade telecoms companies, financial service providers, organizations that have had whose customer data contains really important clues about what's going on in the pandemic and what's the impact of things like lockdowns. And in a lot of situations we're not much further forward in terms of accessing that kind of information. That's actually something that the Royal Society and other learned societies have been pushing. There are some discussion papers online about that, but it's hard work, right? The other thing that I would say in broad terms, so smart cities I'm a bit skeptical about. The Turing Institute is actually having as a major push on digital twins, if that means anything to you. I mean, digital twins are all over the science community and government to an extent in the UK. But I think this idea of urban digital twins, that we can represent cities through simulations and related representations, and then use the AI to assimilate data into those models. And I mean, again, I'm skeptical about optimization per se, but to think about your scenarios, your kind of things that people have been doing in weather forecasting for years to try to evaluate your predictive analytics, that kind of thing. I do think it's not straightforward, but there are opportunities there. So not smart cities per se. A range of fairly unstructured responses in the spirit of your question, I think, but hopefully you get a sense of where I'm coming from.
That's great. Any more questions? I don't see anything in the chat or any hands up.
Daphne has a physical hand up, I think, Harry.
Yeah.
I can't see that. Sorry, Daphne, take it away.
Yeah. So I have some comments to Ron and one question for Oshel. So maybe I'll start with Oshel. First of all, I wanted to comment on your presentation. I think, your research, the use of rooftops in Tel Aviv, that could potentially be expanded to the whole of Israel. I mean, you're talking about our region, and I think that's very important to expand it in the PhD research. Just to mention that your methodology and the extent of this work as a master's research is very impressive. And maybe just to ask you, how do you think you could elaborate on this research, and you being a part of the practice of the being an architect in practice, so your research is very much connected into the actual practice of architects and town planners. What are your plans to actually use this research in practice?
Okay, so first of all, thank you, and we'll see what I'm gonna do in my PhD. And regarding the current, me as an architect working in Israel, right now I can see in a lot of plans and new plans for like new neighborhoods that they are mentioning that the roof is and need to be taken care of as a fifth front, but that's it. Like it depends on the entrepreneur and the architect, whatever they're gonna do with it, and it's usually for the public building, like the residential building, they don't even mention it. So I think that only new policies with the municipality and with the planning institute in Israel will help us giving guidance for the practice to use it. All the water heaters on the roofs and all the electrical equipment, we need to have a specific guidance of the area it should take on a building and live in different area for the residents and etc. So like all kinds of guidance and policies that will help us make it more usable.
I would suggest that first of all, after you finish your research, you go to the Tel Aviv municipality. And once it would be approved in the Tel Aviv municipality, that would spread around. Yeah, so I think you should do it. I mean, you should really consider it. Yeah, together with the flat. Yeah, so good luck. And maybe a few comments for Ron. So Ron, thank you for mentioning our work. So I understand that you're like in the beginning of looking for what you're going to dive into. I would like to suggest something. At the beginning, we did look at realistic environments. And the realistic environments, I mean, they were, it was actually talking to real people that are living in their real homes and in the actual environment of their homes. But then it wasn't like a control environment. I mean, if people that lived in in the east side of a building and on the third floor were talking about or perceiving the environment completely differently of their neighbors on the northern side of the building on the 10th floor. So you couldn't compare it. And this is something that you can do in a VR environment. You can use as in the beginning, virtual twins and of any environment that you want to start and relate to. And then you can manipulate it in a very, very controlled way. And you can choose each time a different element or a different, forgot the actual term in English, that doesn't matter. I think you understand what I mean. And then you can run it and you can have a lot of people that none of them actually live in that specific environment. But then you could always have at least one environment that is really the twin, and then go to the actual physical environment and then compare between the two. And then you would have something that would give you something really strong to rely on, and then see how also the other parameters are perceived in the control environment. Now, another thing is if, I mean, you mentioned the work that I've done with Yala, my PhD student. Unfortunately, she's not with us today. What you read in her paper is what she's done before COVID-19. And during COVID-19, she has a Qualtrics experiment where it's been used since, we couldn't invite participants into the lab because, everybody was at home. As you saw in Osher's pictures, everybody was on the roof or in their apartment. But then we realized that the Qualtrics actually gave us the opportunity to expand our survey to a lot of people. So what the interesting thing is that some of the parameters and the perception of our participants for some of the parameters, we got the same answers. I mean, the parameters that were parallel in both experiments, we got the same answers, the same perception regarding the experiments that were in the lab, in the actual VR experiment. So I would suggest that if this is important for you to realize how the VR can be used as an experiment environment, an experimental environment, or you want to see if there are some differences and so forth, you could really use a lot of tools. And today you really have a lot of tools. I mean, you have these large screens, and you have the immersive VR, and you have the Qualtrics where you can show videos and or just 2D pictures from the simplex or whatever. Okay, so really you have a lot of research environments that you could ask this question and get good answers. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think definitely the things that you mentioned are, if they weren't planned to be in the report before, they definitely are now. I think that's part of why there is a need for just a sort of quick walkthrough. If you're planning to do this kind of research, there are a lot of options. But also, if you remember, I came to you last year asking for help with it. And a lot of them are things I would never have found if I hadn't spoken to you. So I think that there could be a use for a tool that introduces researchers to these sort of new approaches and methodologies and software solutions for this particular field, especially ones that are less accessible, less usable, more expensive. Between all those things that you mentioned, it's also worth mentioning that Yala built her model herself, right? So it is, that not everyone can do that. I think it's definitely a field worth pursuing. So I agree with you. 100%.
So good luck.
Do we have a hand up from Jeffrey? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I would like to react on this as well. I see there's a lot of possibilities in VR, and it's sort of similar to actually for me, the same question as for digital twins in a sense. My problem with that type of research, well, not a problem. I really am amazed by what is being shown by Roy. I don't know how it's pronounced. I find that great, but what I find difficult with digital twins and VR research is the possibility to scale up. I come from a field where we are used to compare cities, and statistically, to get some sense of generalization, and that's where maybe in advising Ron together with Marco, maybe we get a bit lost because we don't see where scaling. Yeah, well, my feeling is basically that scale up those processes to an entire world of complexity of possibilities is not there yet. And so this is something I quite insist to run, is maybe there's a way to be able to actually develop spaces from actual real spaces in a more automatic manner so that we can really scale up that kind of research to a lot more environment. But maybe I'm completely wrong, and I would be very happy to hear about Daphna and Ruiz on this issue of how much, maybe Mark as well, in a sense, because it's this idea of we can do a lot for a digital twin for, I don't know, what a particular city, but what can we learn then for the other cities that would not be used in those systems, and that's for me the complicated issue.
Well, anyone like to quickly come back to that before we move on to Efrat or Roy's question?
Maybe let you respond to Jeffrey first and then I'll go.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. I think that I mean, we can do the same tests on different cities and different twin models, and it will depend on the availability of the data that we already have as in those large data sets. I think the insights that we can gather from those analyses, if I understood you correctly, would be more feasible after we will do a further assessment with people's reaction, because right now we can do all those sorts of tests with the DVA and DESA and collect the numbers, but the numbers are still numbers and they operate inside themselves, and we still lack the. I mean, we know we can infer the sky exposure factor, and we can infer the visible vegetation, but we need to. But what we need to collect the data on how people feel about it, and this is something that we do in our lab with. Daphne mentioned Yala earlier, who is doing it. I mean, looking at people's responses to the data, and I think that this will be the next step to translate the numbers into usable insights. I hope it answers your question.
So I'd like to make two comments, if I may, and maybe slightly at cross purposes. But you mentioned the issue of scaling, Jeffrey, which I think is an interesting one. And I mean, the two things I want to say. I mean, I was brought up on the concept of Occam's razor, and you don't make anything more complicated than it actually needs to be. And I think this is a real danger with digital twins is that we get bound up with trying to represent things in very great fidelity. Again, I think some of this comes from the kind of engineering applications and that sort of thing. And I think it's important for the sorts of things that I'm interested in, at least. I mean, the kind of buildings visualization might be slightly different, but to represent things in a way that's manageable and useful. But digital twin absolutely doesn't mean that you get as much detail in there as you possibly can. It means that you represent something at that level which is useful in terms of the policy decision or the analysis or the understanding or what have you. And that I think is the key to the other kind of scalability and being able to roll them out and making them useful. And gosh, I can't for the life of me think what the second point I wanted to make was now. It's probably closely related, and I'm going to put it in the chat when I remember, but we'll probably better go on to let other people go. I'm sure it was very insightful and important then. It'll come back to me in a minute.
Thanks, and Efrat?
Yeah, well, two comments. First of all, regarding the entire discussion that we just had and what Jeffrey said, I think like every other model that is a simplification of the reality, so the exact thing goes to VR. So this is not the real world, it's just a simplification, a model, and you can gain some insights and put it back to all the other models that you run in the real world. So it's just another tool. So I think you should address it like that and the results as well. Other than that, maybe a suggestion to Daphne that just occurred to me. Most of what you're working about is, according to Haken and Portugali, would be considered as Shannonian information that you can measure. But there is also a semantic information, and you just mentioned the feelings and what Yala is doing. And I think it might be interesting to integrate into your work a semantic information, meaning additional factors that are not emerged from the morphology, but from the absence of what the morphology offers. For example, you said the people in the streets. If you integrate people into your environment or events, extreme events that occur into the situation, then maybe you can get some insights regarding what is more important, the morphological aspects or the life, the actual life in the city. And this is just something maybe you can think about.
Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I remember the other thing, so I might as well say it. I was just, I mean, again, I've been thinking about, well, maybe you have Jeffrey, I'm trying to gauge your amount of grey hair. I've been thinking about these things, since kind of SimCity sort of days, and thinking about those kind of computer games and things. And so, something that I've been kind of saying for a long time is it's relatively easy to generate complex simulations of cities. It's rather more difficult to generate them in such a way that has some combination of realism and utility. And I mean, actually that relates to, I think, the point that Daphne was making about being able to match up the kind of the digital twin, the model, the simulation, what have you, and actually get in there and make some kind of real world comparison and join those things up. And that's the point, one of the points I'm trying to make about AI in a not very articulate sort of way. But this whole question of kind of the assimilation of these hugely rich data sources that we potentially have access to. How can you use those to to enhance, to align, to inform those digital trends and models and kind of policy devices and stuff. So it's very easy to do things that are very impressive but actually not useful or real, or what they're the twin of is anybody's guess, to be frank.
Smart. Roy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I do. First of all, I want to thank you for interesting comments, and I also have a question for Osher. Again, your presentation was very interesting. As someone who grew in Tel Aviv, I never thought of the roofs that way. I was also thinking, maybe you checked it and I missed it, but I saw that you said that you were examining the roofs according to and taking into account the different heights of the buildings. I think that would also could be interesting to see if the roofs have what happens to the roofs who have interaction with the street, or are placed at a height that's relevant to the street, or in contrast to roofs who are at the back of the lot or too high. I think that can also be interesting. Maybe you did look at it. I was just curious to see if there are any differences.
So thank you. I actually did. I examined it, the height and the level of the exposure to the environment, if it's in like a corner building or in the middle of the street, the proximity to the nearest building. So all these morphological parameters are taken in consideration. So it's part of the research, because I really think it can influence, as well as like the use of the gardens beneath the building, if there are a garden apartment and stuff like that, that take some of the activity from the roof in some of the building. Thank you.
Great. It's been a good discussion so far. Have we got any final comments or questions before we wrap up? Ron?
One quick comment, not a question, just wanted to say to Roy, which I've seen your presentation before, and the actual project you did is incredible, but also is just really well presented. It was nice to see it spoken through. I think all three of you had fantastic actual slideshows, and I wish I put more effort into mine just to compare. Thank you so much, I really enjoyed that.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, well, I think that concludes this session. Thanks all for attending and for the discussion, and hope to see you again shortly. Bye all.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks all.
Thank you.